Thank you very much for coming to the supply chains session, which I think is come up in every session I went to yesterday in some way or another, so I'm really pleased we're running it. My name's Vicki Hurd. I'm the head of the farming campaign at Sustain, which is an alliance of over 100 non-governmental organisations, academic bodies, associations, animal welfare, environment, health, public health institutions. So it's a very large alliance because we recognise that the food system is a very complex, big beast, but we need to do it all together. So we talk a lot, we run a lot of campaigns and do a lot of work on the ground as well with practical projects and work at local level with a Sustainable Food Places network, which we formed with a couple of other organisations a few years ago. So we do a lot of work on the ground as well in local areas. But I run the farming campaign, and I always like to say farming and supply chain campaign because we see it as absolutely essential that we start to build supply chains that are more responsive and more farmer-focused and more recognising what farmers need to do to change, to tackle the problems they have and the climate and nature emergency and to respond to the changing trading environment. But particularly so they can actually change what they're doing or make different approaches in their farming and their supply chain and their market will respond positively. That's key. And I think from 30 years working in the farming world and farming policy world, my background's actually in pest management, so I'm not a farmer. But from that, it's absolutely clear that we've built up over the last sort of 2 or 3 decades, particularly, a very unresponsive and harsh retail sector, particularly, and the supply chains do not deliver for farmers what they need in terms of responding to what you need to do with your farm. So we've been developing work on this area for the last few years, and I've been campaigning for many years for the grocery code adjudicator, so looking at the regulatory side to try and get the supply chain, particularly the retailers, but now also the rest of the supply chain, to play fair with farmers. So we got the grocery code adjudicator in the early teens, 2013, which I was campaigning for many years. Now we've got fair dealing codes, which are going to come in as a result of campaigning on the Agriculture Act. But I'm not going to talk about that today, but there is a regulatory side to our work, which is absolutely vital. We've got to make sure they play fair. But what we're talking about today is new routes to market, new supply chains that we want to see develop. And we've got a very ambitious target at Sustain, along with a lot of our members, to get 25% of the market responding to farmers' needs. So farmer-focused supply chains that are not within the current... Sorry, I'm getting very, very thirsty. I'm speaking, I can't speak. So a market share, which is currently pretty small for all the alternative, the local food schemes, box schemes, farm shops, independent stores. It's quite small. I mean, you know, if you look at it in terms of market research, it's 5% or less. We want 25%. And that's very ambitious by 2030. So we want to see the kind of policies at a local, national level able to support the development of the supply chains, the infrastructure, which will deliver a much more farmer-focused supply chain. And I've been working on this many, many years, and I do believe we need the regulation, but I don't think that'll be enough. Therefore, we absolutely need a new route to market for farmers who are doing the kind of things we've been talking about all day yesterday, so they can change what they're doing and still have a good market for their produce and a new market. So that's enough from me. We are aiming for that 25%, and as I said, it's very ambitious, but we've got 3 speakers here today who are pioneers, who are championing what we're talking about here, and have done amazing work actually putting into practice what we're talking about, but also being sort of evangelists for what we're talking about, talking to others and showing that it can be done, and pioneering the ways, and making mistakes, showing how not to do it, how to do it. And so I think there's a really rich talk that you get, 3 talks that you're going to hear today, and then we'll have a Q&A afterwards. And so please think of questions you might want to ask. And one of the things that think about, it's not just the end market, it's everything in between, the missing middle, the wholesalers, the infrastructure, milling, storage, abattoirs, all those kind of things which mean that you can actually process or get added value for your produce as it goes, still getting the value going to you as a farmer. It's absolutely essential that farmers get the true value of what they're producing. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to Jyoti. You can read her biography in the notes. Amazing woman I've been working with for many years, and a co-founder of Land Workers Alliance, which is doing so many things to help people get into farming, do good farming, and she's been working with me on the Agricultural Act for the last 4 years, getting some really great changes. Some great changes in that. It's not perfect, but thank you, Jyoti, for everything you do. And over to you. I think we have...
Hi, yeah. All right. So, I'll talk to you a little bit about my farm and where it comes from, why I'm so passionate about short supply chains and local supply chains. I mean, I'll be honest, I've got quite a small farm. It's a small holding. It's not going to be as large as a lot of the farms and farmers that will be here at this show. But I feel like a lot of the principles can be replicated and scaled up to the benefit of the farm, making it more resilient economically and environmentally, meaning that a lot of what I'm focused on doing on my smallholding farm, I've got 40 acres and I'm starting to manage another 100 acres now, which is, a small for a UK farm. But I've managed to make it financially viable. And the principles of making a small farm like that financially viable to me were having a diverse range of different crops, small amounts of things, not done intensively, but lowering the inputs that I'm putting into each of the elements of the farm, and then adding value to each of those products and then selling them direct to consumer so that I'm getting the full retail price for what it is that I'm producing on the farm. So, for many years, and recently I've expanded into the other 100 acres, but with 40 acres, we started out, we had to get planning permission and a loan to be able to buy our land. We had to make a business plan. And the business plan was really based on all of those elements, having a proper mixed farm. We've got a lot of orchard, and beneath the orchard, and trees are a good thing for the environment, sequester loads of carbon, produce loads of local fruit. We have a big orchard, plums, apples, pears, and underneath that, sheep grazing. And then we've got cows, dairy cows, which I milk and make cheese. The whey from the cheese making goes to the pigs or to chickens, producing eggs or pork products, lots of soft fruit, and a market garden on the farm. And so it's a combination of things where it all works together. And, it's things like in the winter when I overwinter my animals, then I can compost the manure, and use that manure and put it onto the market garden, and it's providing the fertility there. It's about a way of making a cyclical system, and a lot of different products. And I can tell you over the years, I've been doing it for 20 years, many, many years, the market might go for a certain thing, the weather might change, it might be a bad apple year, or whatever it is. There will still be a product that I can sell, so there's that economic resilience there. There's something that will always survive and thrive in whatever, economic conditions are going on, or, the markets, a Waitrose opened one year and it took our whole market away, for a year where people found their feet with our vegetable stall, and well, that year I just sold lots more lamb or did it in a different way to try and have a buffer. We do a lot of preserving, so that we're making apple juice, we're making cider, we're making jams. All of those things are, storing and adding value to the primary product. And it's a wide range of different apples, so it's not all harvested at once, which means we can spread the labor over the season. It means that, we can have all of that things broken up so that it's not, you have to get a load of migrant people to come in and pick for you all in one go. It's actually spreading that over the season. So I think those kind of principles can actually lend to a stronger farming model. And, scaling that up, it's thinking about, okay, if you've got a large arable farm or you've got a large dairy farm, how can we think about going back to making those more mixed farming systems? And I think a lot of the regenerative principles you'll see here what might be about going back to mixed farming systems where you've got the arable and lay rotations, or you've got animals and they're providing the manure and it's composted instead of slurry that you have to pay a disposal cost for or deal with all of that. And then that's put back onto the arable fields, or thinking about taking those farms and re-diversifying and going back to models where you've got that going on and then you start to layer other things into the farming model, you know, whether it's bringing in chickens that are part of the rotation and then selling eggs and meat, or, you know, pigs that might, if you have a dairy farm and you're paying whey disposal costs, you're feeding that whey on a larger scale to pigs and producing pork and bacon and things for sale. You know, how can you actually bring a lot more economic resilience and diversification into your farming model? Because things are changing, things are really changing. With the BPS being changed into elms, you know, a lot of the payments are going to actually be for grass lays that are not so full of protein. You know, it's not going to be loads of, you know, ryegrass lays, you know, if you're going under GS4, you know, in countryside stewardship or something like that. So you actually de-intensify a little bit, but you can add value to your stock and get that final, you know, added retail value, so that you're not selling for the pure commodity prices. Because, like, with our business plan for our farm, anything that we sold on there for global commodity market prices or direct, you know, to abattoir prices or whatever it is, would never have stacked up to make a viable business plan. It's impossible that, you know, that you know, with 4 cows, we could have made a viable business plan. But with 4 cows, if you milk them and then you process that into cheese and you're selling the cheese directly to consumers alongside all your veg and your eggs and everything at a market stall, then it can all add up. You know, so my cows, I can make a 4,000 pound profit a year on 1 cow, because you're actually getting that final value. Compare that to 19 pence a litre that Muller's might pay you, or something like that for a dairy farm, and try to, you know, it makes sense that you can actually add that extra value. So, you know, in a way, that goes along with the ecological management of the land, that rotation is actually healthy for the you know, yeah, for the way the land works. And also things like, if you're keeping pigs, for example, if you're feeding them waste products, if you're feeding them the whey, and find other ways to use byproducts and co-products, that brings your feed costs down by quite a lot. And I calculated, just with adding value through doing my own butchery, we have a meat cutting room on the farm, you know, the $4.50 a kilo you'd get for selling a wholesale carcass of pork would give you about, I don't know, 350 pounds for quite a large pig, not the small, you know, wiener size ones. Yeah, maybe 450 pounds I'd get for the whole carcass selling it like that. But if I added value to it, doing, you know, back bacon, sausages, a bit of something, dry cured meat like salami or something, brawn using the head, you know, and sold all those individual products, then that pig would be worth about 1,500 quid. So it was actually meaning that I could add value in that way, be gaining extra profit for de-intensifying and also cutting my feed costs by using a lot of whey within a cyclical system, if that makes sense. So yeah, it's a lot about adding value. It's a lot about lowering your input costs, about thinking strategically how you take the stuff on the farm and reuse it in another part of your system instead of having high disposal costs or high, you know, taxation on pollution or whatever it is, and using that as a benefit to your farming system. But through selling things direct, there's loads of different routes to market. There's farm shops, there's delivery routes, there's community-supported agriculture, which is a system where the community actually invests in buying farm products so that they then might get a veg box delivery or a meat box delivery or a milk delivery because they've invested at the beginning of the season in it. It keeps things very local. Online sales, there's milk vending machines, which are absolutely taking off around Dorset. I think I've got a slide of it somewhere. These amazing milk machines are like popping up, you know, and farmers are realizing they can make so much more money through the sales, you know, that they do in their milk vending machines, and actually de-intensify, get into a countryside stewardship scheme, and, you know, be more viable than they were trying to sell to like big, you know, processors. What else can you do? You can have collectives that are selling things. Cooperatives are something that are a little bit underused here in the UK. Yo Valley is an amazing one near us, where a lot of dairy farmers sell to Yo Valley, and then they process that and sell that into yogurt, and that gets you into the supermarket chain, but somehow gets a higher share of what's going on to the farmer. There's so many creative ways we can think about this adding value, bringing back more value to the farmer, and collectively using resources to try and get this value-added processing going. Because if you do absolutely everything yourself, it can be quite expensive or time-consuming, and there's not enough hours in the day. But if you think about how to share that out amongst the collective of farmers, maybe get a butcher that's working for several different farms, and then you can get a supply chain linked to that butcher working for you, or a cheesemaker where people pool their milk into in a collective thing. I think it would be a really great thing for the fruit industry to start thinking about processing facilities, because there's a lot of waste and a lot of extra pesticide and fungicide used in the horticulture sector, for lots of cosmetically challenged strawberries or apples that have, problems on them, so they spray to meet supermarket standards. But actually, if you had like apple juicing facilities or cider making companies that would buy that cosmetically challenged fruit, then you might sort of be able to use fewer sprays or, waste less from the horticulture sector. So I think we've got to think a lot more creatively and strategically about how we make all of this easier. One supply chain I'm quite excited about is something we've been doing in the Southwest. I'm probably talking too long. You can cut me off. The last one is that basically it's one where we're doing a supply chain to London, and it's about affordability and thinking about how do we not do all these things so that it's high-end niche markets. Several producers in the southwest of England, especially in wake of COVID, we lost sales to restaurants and pubs. And we thought, what else can we do with this? And of course, during the COVID crisis, there was a lot of food poverty rising, lots of people having to use food banks and community kitchens. And I worked with a colleague of mine in London where we could start to supply London to a community kitchen and to like a food kitchen with produce from the southwest. And somebody that was doing a delivery route to London for quite high-end products said, well, half of the van is empty, let's try and fill it up. And actually, part of the produce it's being sold, paid for at a fair price, just as good as wholesale prices we can get in the West Country, to people directly experiencing, food poverty or on low incomes through kind of a solidarity box scheme where some people pay a higher amount and that subsidizes other people getting food for the price of a food voucher. And I think that kind of model is also very exciting. And if we can think about that, it can really help farmers who, have trouble selling some of the cheaper cuts on a carcass. They can sell their sirloin and things like that, but actually they can also find a market for neck, mince, all those other products, and get, be dealing with the food security we need here in our country. So I'm going to pass on to somebody else, but thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jyoti. Now I'm going to pass on to Natasha Soares, who is co-founder of Growing Communities, which is a fantastic food initiative in Hackney in North London, although it reaches many other areas. But also she runs the Better Food Traders network, which were we co-founders at Sustain as well, sort of? Yeah.
You're definitely partners.
Definitely partners. But she'll tell you all about Better Food Traders. Thanks, Tash.
Okay, thanks, Vicki, and thanks, Jyoti. I'm going to touch on some of the routes to market that Jyoti mentioned in her talk that we're thinking about as sort of direct. Better Food Traders aims to drive growth of UK sustainable horticulture by identifying and supporting those routes to market that are farmer-focused. And by this, we mean retailers, so people who are customer-facing, businesses who are customer-facing, who are aiming to give a good return to farmers. One that covers the costs of providing the public goods, the clean air and water, living soils, decent jobs and thriving communities that are created by an agroecological approach to farming. To us, sustainable means organic or better than organic methods, and we believe in the need for whole supply chains that operate with principles of fairness to people and care for earth, air and water and all living beings. When I'm not working for Better Food Traders, I'm a top fruit grower on a small orchard of 17 acres in Kent. We're certified organic and we sell our apples, plums and pears through Growing Communities Veg Box Scheme, through Local Greens Veg Box Scheme and through Growing Communities Farmers Markets. And both Growing Communities and Local Greens are founder members of Better Food Traders. Selling my fruit through this route to market brings me over 50% of the customer pound. And moreover, I know that these retailers are recruiting customers who prioritise nature-friendly farming over the cosmetics of their fruit. They won't be horrified by a bit of scab on their pear, and they'll see the varying sizes of the apples as a bonus. I was lucky enough to be invited to be part of this enterprise. We're called Pear Necessities. Back in 2007, when an old friend bought some land with the specific purpose of starting up an organic horticulture business. But unless you have connections, money, or visionary old friends, it's almost impossible to access the land, the really, really quite small amount of land that's needed for a viable horticulture business. In the UK, we have fantastic weather. Who agrees? 3 people I think I see over there. Okay, maybe not optimum levels of sunshine, and maybe just a little bit too much rain, and maybe it's usually in the summer holidays. But on the whole, we have enough. We have enough sunshine and we have enough rain for a really wide variety of horticultural produce. This is a food sector that no one surely can argue against expanding. It's gluten-free. It's vegan. To be as healthy as we should be, or might want to be, we should actually be eating 10 portions of fruit and veg a day. But in fact, only 1 in 3 of us get the 5 a day minimum that seemed more achievable when the government set the guidelines. Anyway, you get the point. In the UK, we're only 18% self-sufficient in fresh fruit and only 55% self-sufficient in fresh vegetables. If we all ate even our 5 a day, the UK would need to produce at least 2.1 million tonnes more fruit and veg than we do currently. So there's a massive gap in the market. So to make the most of the land and climate that we so happily have, and make the most of the coinciding health benefits and that massive gap in the market, we should be scaling up fruit and veg production, which seems really obvious to me. However, the UK trend has been in the opposite direction since the 1980s. The blame for this has been squarely laid at the feet of the large multiples who are forever squeezing margins and pushing the costs of cheaper food down the supply chains back to the farmers, making it unviable. Farmers' share of the total pot of money spent in supermarkets is around 9%. The farm gate price of wheat is about 5% of a loaf of bread. The remaining 91% spent on food in supermarkets covers the costs of a range of agents and brokers, the overheads of the supermarkets, and dividends for the shareholders. At Better Food Traders, we're shining a light on fruit and veg retailers who are an alternative to that mainstream supermarket system and who are farmer-focused, meaning that they'll send enough of that customer pound back to the farmer to enable them to earn a viable living, use sustainable growing methods, and treat their workforce fairly. Recent research by the New Economics Foundation monetised the benefits created by growing communities and their farmers market and box scheme, which are their retail outlets. Growing communities are supplied by small and medium-sized fruit and veg growers around the southeast and further afield where necessary. The New Economics report found that much of the power of short local supply chains is that they enable environmentally beneficial production and distribution to be economically viable. By utilising short supply chains and by working in partnership with farmers, growing communities is able to redistribute economic power to farmers, providing them with financial security to generate considerable social value for themselves and even greater benefits for the environment. Really good news. What it comes down to in numbers is that each pound a customer spends with growing communities generates £3.70 worth of benefits to society and the environment, mainly through health and biodiversity improvements. This is in stark contrast to the findings from the Sustainable Food Trust research on true cost accounting from just a couple of years ago that found that a pound spent on food in the mainstream system results in roughly £1 in hidden costs to society and the environment. All the retailers in the Better Food Traders network apply the same principles as growing communities, so those benefits are found across the network. In order to create those kinds of benefits, the food retailer needs to be looking both ways along the supply chain to make sure that the farmer's interests, which include the land's interests, are taken into consideration, not just those of the customer. We believe at Better Food Traders that wholesaling also plays a key part in a better food system because of the benefits to distribution and sales logistics, amongst others. In 2019, Growing Communities developed the Better Food Shed wholesale operation to meet the needs of the 10 and more veg schemes and shops within London who are buying fruit and veg with a farmer-focused approach. And recently, we've been talking to some more ethical wholesalers about the benefits that they bring to fruit and veg producers in other areas. We've spoken to Languages and Organic North. So how can farmers sell into these types of supply chains? There might be some of you here already doing it. Is there? Is anyone selling into a short supply chain here? Oh, right at the back. A couple, 4 maybe. Brilliant. Well, you'll know more about the nitty-gritty of doing that. But I'd say you can hook up with local veg schemes who already have their customer base and are focused on growing it, and they will look after your markets for you. You can sell at a reasonable scale through that shorter supply chain. You can check out the Better Food Traders website to find out if there's a farmer-focused food retailer near you. To sell at an even larger scale, farmer-focused wholesalers will bring buyers together for you. They give you a secure market and help you to sell what you have, rather than demanding that you grow what their buyers want, though they may give you advice on what their buyers might want next year. Most importantly, they'll pay promptly and maintain a loyal relationship. The Better Food Shed and Languages on London's outskirts and Organic North in Manchester are good examples of farmer-focused wholesalers. And we've only just started our research on wholesale operations, so we know there's others. Being certified organic generates trust in production methods further down the supply chain, and wholesalers selling to Better Food Traders members require organic certification. Another really important thing you can do if you don't farm fruit and veg, but you have a large land base, is to offer a small acreage up for a market garden corner. One of the reasons Tyler Cotton of Dynamic Organics had the confidence to take on 3 acres of Burwash Manor's 400-acre arable and livestock holding was because he knew he had a reliable and sympathetic local route to market in Cambridge Organic Food Company's VegBox scheme. 8 years later, he's still supplying them with salads, cucumbers, tomatoes, chard, and more. And he's taken on assistant growers and been able to expand his site. And moreover, in the winter months, when there's less to do on the growing site, Cambridge Organic VegBox Company give him a bit of work in their packing. And lastly, I'm going to finish with a quote, which is from Metzger van der Laan, who's a grower at Boar Place in Kent and a supplier to the Better Food Shed, who's the wholesaler supplying the Better Food Traders in London. He says this: "It's a joy to supply and trade with people who are in it for the right reasons, locally produced, respect for nature and the people who work the land. I hope I can pay this back with good quality vegetables for years to come. The ethos of the Better Food Shed guarantees me and my employees an honest price for our produce. I hope to grow organic veg for many more years. Although no farming practice is 100% sustainable, every acre farmed organic is a step away from destructive farming practices. I hope and see that our way of farming and trading is about quality and profit for all." Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. And thank you for doing that poll. I would like to sort of follow on with a poll, because James over there is from Sustain as well. We're doing a survey of 500 farmers all types of farmers, a snapshot of the UK farming community, on what are the barriers and opportunities they see for doing a different supply chain. And it's already giving us some interesting results, isn't it, James? But I would like to know, any of you here interested in changing your supply chain, changing your market? And anybody wanted to confess that? That's great. So it's interesting. And we're going to be doing some mapping work in 2 regions just to look at what the supply chain is at the moment, the infrastructure, and what the needs are if the farmers in that area wanted to change what they were doing, find a different market, add value, what the infrastructure and opportunities would be, what they would look like, and what finance, particularly. Finance is a big issue when it comes to infrastructure, obviously. What would be needed to supply what they want to do. Just wanted to ask you if you're interested in that. But now I'm going to go on to Josiah, who is amazingly started the Hodmedods initiative around producing proteins for UK market, and has pioneered some amazing stuff. So you can read about him in the biog, but over to you, Josiah.
Thanks, Vicki. I'm going to stand up because I'm too jiggly to sit down. I just don't like...
Jiggly, that's good.
So welcome, and thanks for this opportunity to speak a little bit about what Hodmedod does and why we do it. And we do it because of an existential threat that we all face, and everyone's very much aware of that in the room here. I think we know that climate change is happening, biodiversity loss is happening. We are facing uncertain times in terms of the economic and social structures that we've come to depend on, and all of those things are connected. It's a kind of complex, almost intractable, apocalyptic scenario that we face, and that can be massively overwhelming and depressing. And I'm going to now go and talk about some much more positive aspects of that. And 2 friends and I, Nick Saltmarsh and William Hudson, were working for a small regional non-governmental organisation called East Anglia Food Link from really the early 2000s through until about 2010 or 12. And we did loads of work, the sort of work that Sustain are doing, which is really fantastic, about engaging with the production base, engaging with the supply chain, understanding how public procurement might work, how can we get more local food going on there, how can we encourage more farmers to convert to organic. And really in around 2008-9, we really had this kind of existential crisis. There is something massive on the horizon that we need to address. And my goodness, we are not addressing it. It's not happening in policy. It's not coming from government. The changes that we need to see around land management and the food system, that's not happening fast enough. And we began working with a small group in Norwich called Transition City Norwich. They're part of the Global Transition Network. And they asked us, could a city the size of Norwich feed itself? Could 160,000 people grow all their food from the hinterland, from the land that surrounds the city? And how would we need to change diets? How would we need to change land use? And what would that city look like in terms of the kind of social structures and the political will that would be needed to happen? That's an amazingly interesting thought experiment, we thought. And we created some Excel workbooks, and we crunched lots of numbers, and we looked at macro and micronutrients, and we worked out where the best land was, and we worked out what people were eating currently. And we realized that Norwich could feed itself, and more importantly, Norfolk could meet its agricultural commitment to the rest of the UK and to those urban areas with higher population densities, but also a global commitment to food production. But that we'd have to massively change the way we eat and the way we farm. And broadly speaking, it would be a regenerative agroecological system, much less meat, but still livestock for nutrient cycling, and critically, a lot more plant-based protein. And obviously, in the years since, plant-based protein has become very much kind of ghettoized into this idea about vegan diets and things, but this is a much more kind of holistic approach where we introduce these nitrogen-fixing crops into the rotation to build soil organic matter, to feed the following crops, but also to feed us with this low carbon intensity, low water demanding, very nutrient dense food. And that meant changing the way people eat. And it also meant encouraging more production to happen. And we began speaking to farmers and saying, well, would you grow beans? Would you grow peas for human consumption in the UK? And Yes, we would, but there's no market for it, the price is wrong, there's no supply chain for it. We'll sell into animal feed because it's a secure sale, we know what we're going to get at the end of the year. Or if we meet a human consumption export grade for fava beans, we'll sell to Egypt, and that's all good. And it became increasingly clear to us that what was missing was that route to market, that mechanism that allows volume from arable farms producing combinable crops to go into the human consumption market, and a short value-added supply chain that would facilitate that process. Who here is an arable farmer? Have we got any arable farmers in the room? How much wheat are you producing, for example, if you're producing cereals? But just in total, what's your output, roughly speaking? 600 tons. Fantastic. Could you sell it at the farm gate? Could you take it to your local farm shop and put it in place? And this is the problem, where with horticulture and livestock, it is quite easy to create that local market. They're not easy things to do, but it's quite easy because they're relatively easy for people to engage with. They're quite high value, and people need them every week or on a regular basis. The cereal crops and the bean crops and the pulse crops, where you've got a single harvest, it goes into store, treated in volume. The volume and the economies of scale make it really hard to relocalize that crop. And we realized that the sort of role that we needed to fill was a national role, and that relocalization in the case of these commodity crops and breaking that commodity trap would initially have to happen at a national level. We'd have to be working with farmers in order to be able to buy full loads, for example, 28, 29 tons at a time, and put that through quite a conventional seeming processing and supply chain in order to then sell that locally. And so we began on a very modest scale working with export crops. So we took split fava beans, which were going to Egypt to make tamea, which is a type of falafel, and whole fava beans, which would be going to make fulmadamas, which is across all of North Africa and the Middle East. That is the dish that you break fast with during Ramadan, and it's also the dish that you'd have for breakfast with an egg. It's delicious. We don't eat it, and we haven't eaten those beans really for 400 years, since we industrialized, since we got rich, and we didn't need that overwinter protein store. So we began by just taking some of that export out, testing the market, and seeing if people would buy it. And as we succeeded in that process and began to add other combinable crops, we realized we were getting to the volumes where we could work directly with farmers. So we could approach a farmer, and our first farmer was a chap called Mark Lee, Green Acres Farm in Shropshire. And Mark approached us and said, I'm producing organic peas. They're going into the animal feed market. I'd really like to see them doing what my beef does, what my vegetables do, and go directly to an end consumer where they can see where the pulses have come from. So we asked him to grow 4 different varieties of peas on the farm. I don't think he's ever grown 4 different varieties of peas since, but that's a learning process for all of us. We bought those ex-farm, we got them cleaned, we put them into little 500-gram packs. They have Mark's name on them, grown at Green Acres Farm, Mark Lee. And they go out directly to our end customers through our website, so direct sales. They're going in bulk volume into processors who are making soups or stews or ready meals. They are going into retail in those retail packs. So we sell into distributor and wholesale. We sell to you, Natasha, which is fantastic. And they're also going directly into catering, which obviously is coming back now, which is fantastic. But for that disappeared for a while. And we see our role as facilitators and enablers. We're not farmers, and we know a little bit about farming, but we don't know enough about farming. But what we do know how to do is how to take that volume ingredient, which is otherwise really, really difficult for the farmer to sell directly, and tell the story of the farm, add the value and create the market, and then make a better return to the farm in order to encourage and facilitate broader changes that are going on there. So having started with peas and beans, we then moved into thinking about the whole rotation. What are the oilseed crops? Where are we going to get linseed and camelina and chia? What are the other seed crops that we might be thinking of? And everything from coriander seeds through to quinoa. And how are we going to start rethinking about cereals? How are we going to decommodify those volume cereals? And where you might be growing yield is king, generally speaking. And even though we know that we should be thinking about profitability per unit, we still tend to think about your immediate answer. How much wheat do you grow? It's per acre, and it's what you should really think: how profitable is that wheat per acre? And thinking about growing varieties that might be lower yielding and better suited for low input farming systems. How do we compensate the cost differential in the yield penalty that farmer might be facing? And we might be quite dramatic changes in the price return to farm per tonne. So you might be going from £250 a tonne for a fairly standard milling wheat. You might then be looking at £650, £750 a tonne for a kind of a heritage or more unusual variety. And that's absolutely fine. And we can add value to that. We can communicate what the added value is to the end consumer, and they are prepared to pay that price. And that's the only way we're going to support change on farm. If we don't return value back to the farm, all the regenerative work that I'm sure you're all doing fantastically is not going to have a long-term effect. I know that there's a feeling within the sort of regen ag movement that if we can reduce our input costs, we can take a yield penalty and we can compete with commodity, and that will all be fine. Trust me, that is a race to the bottom. We need a radically different system in order to facilitate long-term, sustainable, resilient change. And what we really need in there is what we're kind of broadly calling regenerative retailers to match up with the farmers. So these are creating, you use the word supply chains, Vicki, which I'm always very anti, but we need networks of supply that are mutually supportive, that are relational, not transactional, and that enable and facilitate a connection between producer, consumer, retailer, academic, researcher, food writer. All of that ecosystem, that network, is essential if we're going to avert that apocalypse, which I rather bleakly alluded to earlier on. And I just would recommend everyone here who is particularly in combinable crops to really think about ways of cooperating with each other on grain processing, on small-scale drying, on ways in which you can add value to at least a percentage of your combinable crop production, and to really think about what those direct routes to market are, how you might add value to that, how you might collaborate with a local miller or with a local baker in order to create that shorter loop to market. And if you want to talk to us about how we might help you do that, please do. We'd be delighted. Thanks, Vicki.
Thank you very much, Josiah. Fantastic. And it was so important to have Josiah talk about that, because obviously people, think, as you said, in horticulture and meat, a lot more direct sales are happening and more trading platforms are there. But for combinable crops, arable crops, commodity crops, very hard to see how it can change. But Josiah is an example of where that's happening. And obviously it's a process, it's not end, we've got not perfect, and we need to find the markets for the wheats, as you're saying, and other crops. But it can be done. And now I'd like to open up for questions, if you have any. Thank you. Just checking how long I've got. Can't see my watch. Right. You put your hand up first.
Hi there. Thanks, everybody. Really interesting. I've got a question for Josiah. How do you think supermarkets fit into the future of food sales, given that they do a lot more and they facilitate a convenience that I think is going to be far people to move away from? They sell not just food. So there are some, I'm from Stroud, there are some solutions that try and emulate local supply chains for every product that supermarkets have, and they don't work. They don't have the capacity in the way that a farm shop can be.
I'll just repeat that, some of it anyway. How do we really compete with the supermarkets that do so much for consumers? Not compete.
How do you think they fit?
Okay. Yeah. So how do we fit in? And in a way, I'm talking about 25%. Really? You can say, really? Is that realistic when they have currently much more of the market? But
just to clarify, I'm explicitly saying not instead of. Is there a solution that involves supermarkets? So
I see.
Supermarkets facilitate local sales.
Okay.
It doesn't mean you don't get fantastic farmers markets, but it's not this sort of dichotomy, either with or without supermarkets.
So can supermarkets be part of the solution and facilitate this? Sorry to mischaracterise your question, but I found you can't hear the question in these things unless it's repeated. So anybody want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, supermarkets can definitely be part of the solution. They have to want to be part of the solution, and we have to encourage them to want to be part of the solution, I think is the key. We don't sell to supermarkets. We could do, but we don't really want 90-day trading terms. We couldn't cash flow that for a start. And there's a lot that they need to get in order before smaller producers will want to engage with them. They have a bad rep, let's face it, for good reason. But they are where people shop. And we have, in the past, way back actually with our East Anglia Food Link days, with what was then the biggest, may still be the biggest supermarket chain, they had some quite radical ideas about relocalisation, which for various reasons they didn't deliver. But I do feel that there is will there to engage in that conversation. And I think as a community, of people doing these things, we do have to be open to having that conversation with them and not always demonise them. But it is a slightly intractable problem.
It is interesting. One of your partners, William, I worked with William Hudson to get the government to introduce the grocery code adjudicator to try and get the supermarkets, as was then top 7 supermarkets, to play fairer with their farmers. And William was a living example of where they hadn't been playing fair and then undermined his farming system as a result. They'd just been really mucking him around and having a really bad deal with the contract and everything. Way back when, I don't know, a long time ago, but we've got to change their business model if they're going to really be part of the revolution you were talking about, I would say. But yeah, they're part of the solution. Either other want to say anything about that? Or?
I just wanted to say that I think in our model we see supermarkets as having a role with a different form of business model, but possibly not for fresh. So fresh generates a lot of waste if it goes through a supermarket, and can be dealt with in direct, localised chains better. But dried goods have got a place in a supermarket. Perhaps we might want to call them something other than supermarket at that stage, though.
Another question. Gentleman over there.
Are farmers too worried about regulation and laws?
Are farmers too worried about regulation and laws?
I mean, I was a dairy farmer and seemed to have quite a few regulations that I had to. And if you were to ask me to grow artichokes or something, I think, well, I've got another book of regulation.
I see. So if you change what you're growing, load more regulations. Anybody want to say something about that?
I think there are lots of farmers in the room. I feel they often have quite a healthy approach to the regulations, which is that they'll fill in the forms that they're absolutely compelled to fill in and possibly gloss over the others.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. There are a lot of barriers to entry, and I think some of those are created barriers by the very supermarket system that we're talking about. That establish food safety practices, for example, which are often cosmetic rather than actually critical. And I think sometimes they can feel like barriers to entry, but actually when you look at them, then they're not particularly. There are obviously key food safety issues that need to be addressed, and as someone working in dairy, you're well aware of that. But I think it feels to me like it is all manageable, and I think probably part of our role is dealing with some of those technical requirements that come from the customer. We sometimes have to fill in 600 question forms just to supply often quite a small retailer, and that can be.
I was actually talking to a fruit grower the other day. I was talking about, I'll name it, Red Tractor, and having to fill in and deal with Red Tractor took a huge amount of time, he said. So, we're doing work on peri-urban farms, building capacity to have peri-urban farms to supply urban markets more. And he was saying, be careful about that because you'll have to fill in loads of forms if you're going to have it accredited with Red Tractor. But I think you're right. There's ways around it. There's obviously a benefit in having traceability, but the closer you are to your market, the more trust you can have from your consumers, I think, and you maybe don't have to go through loads of hoops. Does anybody else want to comment on that, or should we?
Well, I think it's also healthy to have an attitude that some of the regulations are quite a good thing, and actually we might have to prompt ourselves because there are things that need to be done. You know, a lot of the things about, you know, reducing emissions of nitrous oxide and things like that. I mean, we are needing to transition very quickly to a planet that will be livable for future generations. And we've got to bear that in mind, you know, and farmers do need to think about food security for the next generation. And, you know, if it means changing from a slurry system that's actually causing loads of emissions, and that might cost a bit and means a bit of a radical rethink about what you do, starting to compost the manure or whatever it is and spread it on the fields for the soil, maybe it's worth investing in that and just going, it's not just all there because some bureaucrat put it in a place. It's actually something that we really need to do and take seriously. You know, there's a balance. There's definitely regulations, you know, that are a bit silly.
Yeah. Catherine, do you want to come?
Yeah, I thought it'd be interesting. I mean, how many vegetable farmers out here are regulations are interested in the sizes of the vegetable? So if you want to grow
Artichokes, yeah.
you just mentioned regulations says it got to be all of the same size. It's got conformities.
Well, you have a grading system which is marketing led, yeah, and we've got to move away from that. Yeah, good point. The lady there.
Just I love what you're doing at Hot Dogs. It's just fantastic. What's stopping you becoming much, much bigger? Is it supply or demand or?
What's stopping Hobby Dods becoming bigger?
It's all of those things, really. So one of the things that we're always really careful to do is ensure that demand always exceeds supply. It's the classic farming thing. Oh, there's a market, let's grow for it. Suddenly the market's flooded and the price drops. And so making sure that we're not in an oversupply situation where it ends up becoming a buyer's market and sort of devalues what it is, effectively commodifies what it is that we're trying to do is key. I think the fact that our network of supply is relational limits our scope for growth. People work with us because they work with us. You can see Andrew Trump at the back there who works with us. And it's because it's not straight, we're not grain traders. It's not straightforwardly transactional. And it's difficult for us to have a much larger network than we've got, which is probably 25 or 30 farmers that we're engaging with directly. I think getting beyond that is quite difficult. So what we really need is more Hobmadods.
Yeah.
We started off thinking nationally. As we grow demand and awareness for those products regionally, wouldn't it be great if it was just Hobmadod in East Anglia and we were able to run a business that employed us and allowed us to do what we wanted to do and did what we needed for the farmers to do, and there could be a Southwest Hobmadod doing with a different name, doing what it does down there. And I think, you know, that's the model. It's instead of scaling up, getting bigger, it's how do we scale out? How do we take these ideas and make them work in a relational way in a different place?
There's a goal, 100 Hobmadods by 2015. Sounds fantastic. Lady at the back.
On that note, at the moment we're producing oats that are being processed in the island because there's nowhere that
No.
processed organic oats is processed. So I think Hobmadods is some processes. Do you see a growth in that kind of local processing, like milling, processing oats, and so I think that's a big obstacle as well in selling and producing locally.
So it's about processing oats. We don't have capacity in the UK to process organic oats, so they're going to Ireland and then coming back here. Yeah, I know a lot of organic meat goes to Germany to be processed and come back here as sausages. Seems really amazing opportunity to build the capacity here, but it would require finance and also proper chain of process, producers and where it goes to. Any comments on that?
Well, there's someone better placed in here to comment on that, actually. He's sitting at the back, and that's Andrew Trump from Organic Arable. But the issue with oats really is, I mean, there is processing in the UK, but the scale is very large of all oat processing. There are very few processors, and because of the way that the oats are processed, the steaming and the rolling and the kilning, and it has become very centralised, and because the oats need to be dehulled and things like that. And in terms of processing, we do milling, but we don't really do much of the other processing. And when we started, we realised we could invest a lot of money in buying equipment and learning how to use it, but there were already lots of people, particularly in East Anglia, which is predominantly, it's arable production. There was already grain cleaning, there was already processing facilities. So we used existing capacity and skills to do that. I think there is some scope for small-scale processing to happen, and there are bits of processing equipment that we would like to buy in the future around small-scale grain cleaning, for example, where we have batches that really just won't go through any of the on-farm capacity that we currently use because they're just too small. But oat processing is really, really interesting. It's challenging.
I mean, one of the things that James and I hope to do is to push for the, finance to enable small-scale or medium-scale farmers who want to add value to get access to the finance to do that, possibly through local through the regeneration funds and shared partnership. What's it called? Shared Prosperity Fund, which is taking the funds that we used to have rural regeneration and activities like LEADER funds from Europe, all come back to the UK, obviously, with Brexit. Those funds should be used to generate the kind of capacity, what you're talking about, to be able to process and sell more locally and regionally. So that's one of our campaigns, I hope, that we're going to go forward. And partly why we're doing survey and mapping on what should I call it if it's not supply chains? Networks? Networks of supply. There we go. We've got a new, longer word to call it. That's fine. I understand where you're coming from. Oh, actually, a lady here first, and then we'll come to you. Okay.
First of all, Josiah, it's really refreshing that you said that you didn't want to just scale up, scale out. That's quite rare. So that's really nice to hear. My question is, I'm just started transitioning into a mixed farm. How do I stimulate my local market that is very obesogenic, food desserts, all they do is go to the supermarkets?
Where are you at?
Northwest London.
I'll just repeat the question. How do I stimulate my local market as I transition to a more diverse farming? It's a great question. Anybody want to?
Northwest of London. Are you diversifying into any horticulture? So get in touch with the Better Food Shed, definitely.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I'm not an expert in it. How did you stimulate your market?
Yeah, I think, you just need to get out there and start meeting people, and it can be from all different backgrounds. And I think don't limit to just thinking, it's got to be an affluent market or whatever, because they might shop at supermarkets now, but it's not necessarily because, that's totally what people want. They might just not realize there's another option on offer, and it could be an accessible, affordable price or is convenient, whatever it is, and think about how you reflect your supply, how you're supplying it so that it meets people's needs. So if you kind of get out and meet people and work out what it is that they need, what times of day would they want to shop, or would they need delivery, or would they need this, or would they need that, and actually think about that and incorporate it into things, because if things just land in an area without necessarily communicating with the local people that it's the right.
Did you use local media
them.
at all? I mean, local media, local radio, or local platforms? Yeah. So using local media to get a sense of how people respond.
Yeah,
get an article
and talking to loads of local people and that kind of thing. And I think some of the, particularly we're working with loads of projects that are trying to set up things in, kind of food desert kind of communities and things now. We're really encouraging people to go and talk to the community first before you just decide, this is the right thing for them, and kind of actually put your own projections on what the community might want, because it's much more effective. And one thing I'd like to encourage some farmers to go into is producing halal products as well. I've been talking a lot with the Asian community, Asian diaspora community, and there is a shortage of very good quality pasture-fed or organic, lamb and beef that's slaughtered to halal standards humanely. And it might be a really good market for people to start to move into if you could work with a community to develop those supply chains.
How did Growing Communities get its, how many, 5,000 people it's now supplying? Do you know, with the veg box?
Great marketing.
Great marketing.
And being embedded in a local community.
And it did grow from smaller, didn't it?
Yeah.
So the word of mouth.
As Jyoti says,
schools are a good way to start to work with the schools.
Yeah, getting out into pre-existing community groups and centres, operating from a community centre where there are other groups meeting there already. all those sorts of things.
Yeah, and farmers markets, if you've got one, that's a way to obviously, you haven't got one. No, it's not that area.
Churches, yeah.
Yeah. Over there. Thank you.
Just a response. I work for a company called Organic Arable. We're involved in the open supply chain that was mentioned. And I think in this discussion, it's really important to consider scale. Because I would consider that to be a farmer-focused supply chain. We're supplying now 9,000 tonnes of grain. So it's big scale, and that's going into the retailers. But just because it's big doesn't mean it necessarily can't be farmer-focused. And that's the point that I wanted to make. But also, I think the other challenge we face as we try and change the food system is actually what is the appropriate scale that we should work with.
Yeah.
Because what I wouldn't necessarily want to see is we want to return money to producers and deliver the benefits that you've been talking about. But if we do recreate too much processing, actually the economies of scale, particularly in the agri sector, are massive when it comes to processing. And if we bring it down to too small a scale, we simply spend money on that section of the supply chain or supply network, that would have
Taking the money out of the system.
in the system.
Yeah.
And so it's just really, we need to work out what is appropriate scale to be working at. And I don't think that those scales will be the same in the different sectors, of the food industry. So that was really the point I wanted to
Okay. No, very fair point. Did everybody hear that? Sort of it's about scale, and don't assume that big is going to be a problem, but also we've got to really examine for the different sectors, the different products that what will work for them in terms of processing. Because if you just invest in small-scale processing, it might suck the money out of the chain, so to speak, and be inefficient in a way that doesn't help. Did anybody want to?
Well, I mean, that's as Andrew well knows, that's exactly why we use existing capacity to do a lot of the processing work. It does not make sense for every farm to get all of their own processing equipment to do that. That is a level of relocalization that involves unnecessary capital expenditure and acquisition of skills which are not necessary to the production of those crops. So, as Jyoti, as you were saying, cooperation and working through networks like Organic Arable, which facilitate those processes, will ensure that we can make that return to farm, but we can also still have a price point that is acceptable to customers who often are very stretched. So I think there is a balance that has to be achieved there.
But I think probably we've gotten the balance all the way in the other direction in a way, because it's very centralised processing for a lot of it. So there's something to be done. But sorry. Gentleman there, sorry, and that's the last question, I'm afraid. I've gone slightly over time.
Returning to the opening of a market and trying to develop a business, I think a word that's forgotten a lot is trust.
Yeah.
And if you cannot develop trust,
absolutely.
the consumer cannot develop trust in you, you're going nowhere. You have to have trust.
Yeah, you have to have trust. Very, very good point to end on. Thank you, sir. And can I ask you to give a round of applause for our wonderful speakers? Thank you. Thank you for coming.